You have been told a lie about when Rome ended. Not on purpose. Nobody sat you down and deceived you. But somewhere in your schooling, a date settled into the back of your mind and stayed there. A year, 14 centuries old, when the last emperor in the West was quietly pushed off his throne, and the legions melted away, and the togas were folded up forever. That, you were taught, was the end. The fall of the Roman Empire. The lights going out across Europe. It is one of the most widespread misunderstandings in all of history, because Rome did not die in the West. It walked away. It moved east, to a city on the edge of two continents, where it changed its language and changed its faith, and kept its name, and went on calling itself Roman for another 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Read that again and let it land. While Europe forgot how to read, while castles rose and crusades came and went, while the world you think of as medieval was born and aged and began to crumble, there was still a Roman emperor, still wearing the purple, still ruling from a throne that traced its line in an unbroken chain all the way back to the Caesars. The empire of Augustus did not end in some gray afternoon of the 5th century. It ended on a single terrible morning in the spring of 1453. And the man who was emperor that morning, the heir to a title 1,100 years deep, died in the streets with a sword in his hand and was buried in no tomb because no one could ever find his body. Think about that for a moment. The last Roman emperor has no grave. The most powerful office the Western world had ever invented, the line that ran from the men who built the Colosseum and conquered the known earth. It does not end with a funeral or a monument or even a corpse laid out in state. It ends with a single human being throwing off the marks of his rank so that no one would know him, and vanishing into a crowd of dying men. We do not know where he fell. We do not know what happened to what was left of him. The longest story in the political history of the world simply stops, mid-sentence, in the smoke. And here is the part that should keep you awake. We remember the conquerors. We remember the young sultan who took the city, his name carved into the side of history in letters tall as towers. We remember the cannon, the strategy, the date. Those things are safe. They are written down 1,000 times over. But the people inside the walls that night, the ones who knew, with absolute certainty, that they were the last generation of a world that had lasted 1,000 years, almost none of them left us a word. Tens of thousands of human beings, the last citizens of the oldest surviving empire on Earth. Mothers, soldiers, priests, sailors, children. People who went to sleep on the 28th of May in a world that had always existed and woke up, those who woke up at all, into a world where it never would again. And history kept almost none of them. So tonight, we are going to walk back inside those walls, not as the Sultan, not as the generals on their horses, but as the people who stood on the broken ramparts in the dark and watched the end coming for 53 days and chose, most of them, to wait for it where they stood. We are going to ask the question the chronicles never quite answer. What was it like to be alive in the last days of Rome? Because the closer you look at this, the stranger it gets. The city was not what you imagine. The defenders were not who you'd expect. In the way it fell, the small, almost accidental things that decided it, the prophecies, the gate that someone forgot to lock, the conqueror who wept over what he had destroyed, none of it is the clean story of swords and walls you may be carrying in your head. And somewhere inside it, somewhere in the silence of all those people who knew they were watching the death of their entire world, there is a truth about what it means to be human that we spend most of our own lives refusing to face. Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this, you will understand not only how the longest-lived empire in history finally died, but why a man could choose to give his life for a city that everyone, including him, knew was already lost. And you may find that question following you home. Let's begin where the story has to begin, with the greatest city in the world. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what it was. For most of 1,000 years, when people across 3 continents said, "the city," just that, the city, with nothing else attached, everyone knew which one they meant. There was only one that needed no other name. The way we might say, the ocean, and not mean any particular sea. It sat where Europe reaches across the water to touch Asia, on a triangle of land between 2 seas and a deep, sheltered inlet of a harbor. And it had been placed there by an emperor named Constantine, who looked at that spot and understood something the whole future would prove him right about. Whoever held this ground held the door between the worlds. The trade of the East and the trade of the West both had to pass through here. Armies could not march from one continent to the other without reckoning with it. It was the hinge on which 2 halves of the earth turned. And it grew rich beyond the imagination of anyone who never saw it. We have to be careful here, because rich is a word we use so loosely it has almost stopped meaning anything. So let me try to make you feel it. When travelers came to this city from the kingdoms of the West, from places that were, by comparison, muddy clusters of timber and thatch, they did not just admire it, they lost their composure. They wrote home that they had not believed such a place could exist. The markets overflowed with things they had no names for: silks woven with thread of gold, spices carried from the far side of the world, jewels and ivory and perfumes and glass clear as water. The streets were paved. There was running water and public baths and street lighting and hospitals and libraries holding the accumulated thought of the ancient world, the philosophy and the mathematics and the medicine of Greece and Rome, copied and preserved here while it was being lost everywhere else. A knight from the kingdoms of the north, seeing it for the first time, could be forgiven for thinking he had stumbled into a dream of heaven. But it was not the wealth that made the city the center of the world. It was something less tangible and far more powerful. It was the certainty of being chosen. The people of this city believed, with their whole hearts, that they were the inheritors of 2 glories at once. They were Romans. They never called themselves anything else, never thought of themselves as anything else. This fact alone tends to break the modern brain. The direct, unbroken continuation of the empire of the Caesars, the last living piece of the ancient world. And they were the chosen guardians of the Christian faith, the protectors of the true religion, the city that God himself had set as a wall between Christendom and everything that would devour it. Their emperor was not merely a king. He was, in their understanding, God's own viceroy on earth, the living link between heaven and the world, crowned in a ceremony so heavy with sacred meaning that to witness it was believed to be a kind of grace. Their great church, and we will stand inside it before this is over, was held to be the holiest building in all of Christendom, a place so vast and so luminous that the legend said the ambassadors of a distant northern people, sent to find a faith for their nation, walked into it and reported back that they no longer knew whether they stood on earth or in heaven. Hold on to that image, the light pouring down through the great dome, because we are going to come back to that church on the last night when the people of the city crowd into it by the thousand, weeping, waiting for a miracle that the prophecy promised them and that does not come. So this was the city, the hinge of the world, the second Rome, the New Jerusalem, a place that had stood for over 1,000 years and had come, quite reasonably, to believe that it would stand for 1,000 more, that it was simply a permanent feature of the universe, like the sea, like the sky. And here is the first turn of the knife, the first thing that should unsettle you. By the time our story begins, almost none of that was true anymore. The city of 1453 was a magnificent corpse that had not yet been told it was dead. The wealth had drained away over centuries of loss. The trade that once flowed through it had been seized by sharper, hungrier rivals. And the population, the great teeming millions of the city at its height, had collapsed so completely that a person could walk for an hour through the inside of the walls and pass through fields and orchards and the ruins of districts where no one lived anymore, and the silent shells of churches with their roofs fallen in. Whole neighborhoods had reverted to farmland. Vines grew over palaces. The greatest city in the world had become a scattering of villages, huddled inside walls built for 10 times their number. How does that happen? How does the center of the world hollow out from the inside until only the shell remains? That is the next door we have to open. And what's behind it is a story of decline so slow, so grinding, and so quietly devastating that the people living through it could feel their world ending around them for generations and could do absolutely nothing to stop it. Because before we can understand the death of the city, we have to understand its long dying. An empire does not fall the way a tree falls. There is no single crack, no moment when everyone looks up and sees it coming down. An empire falls the way a great house falls, when no one can afford to keep it. Slowly, room by room, a leak here, a collapsed wall there, doors closed off because they can no longer be heated, until one day, the family is living in 2 rooms of a mansion that used to hold 100, telling themselves it is only temporary, that better years are coming, that the old glory will return. That was the story of the city for the last 200 years of its life, and the cruelest part is that the people inside it knew. This is something we rarely let ourselves imagine, what it is to belong to a civilization on the way down, and to know it. We are used to thinking of decline as something historians notice afterward, drawing lines on a chart. But the men and women of the late city did not need a historian. They could see it with their own eyes. They could walk past the ruins their grandparents had told them were once full of life. They could read the chronicles of the old emperors who had ruled from the Danube to the deserts of the east, and then look out from the walls at an empire that had shrunk, in living memory, to almost nothing. They knew they were the diminished children of a greater age. They lived every day inside the architecture of a power they no longer possessed, like a man wearing the armor of a giant. How had it come to this? Through 1,000 wounds. But there was one that never healed. One betrayal so total that it broke the city's back 2.5 centuries before the end. And it is one of the bitterest ironies in the whole of history. The city was not first conquered by its enemies. It was conquered by its friends. In the year 1204, an army of Western Christians, crusaders, men who had taken the cross and sworn holy oaths to march east and fight for the faith, turned aside from their pilgrimage, sailed to the greatest Christian city on earth, and stormed it. They were supposed to be its brothers. They shared its God, its scripture, its savior, and they sacked it with a savagery that shocked even the age that produced them. For 3 days they burned and looted and murdered their way through the holiest city in Christendom. They tore the bronze and the gold from the churches. They smashed the tombs of the emperors and scattered the bones to get at the jewels. They stabled their horses in the sanctuaries. They dragged a prostitute onto the throne of the great church and had her sing while they pillaged. I want you to sit with the strangeness of that, because it tells you something dark about how thin the line between brother and stranger really is. The treasures they carried away that day still sit, 8 centuries later, in the churches and museums of the West. The horses of bronze, the relics, the marble. They were not taken by some alien horde from beyond the edge of the world. They were taken by fellow believers who had come, supposedly, to help. The city survived it. After a generation under foreign occupation, its rulers clawed it back. But the body that returned to the throne was not the empire that had been driven out. It was a shadow. The wealth was gone, scattered across Europe, never to return. The provinces had broken away and would never come back. The trade had been seized by the merchant republics of the West, who now ran the commerce of the East for their own profit and let the city take the scraps. From that day forward, the Second Rome was no longer a great power pretending at decline. It was a small power pretending at greatness. A single city and a few coastal scraps, calling itself an empire because it could not bear to call itself anything else. And the men who came after had to govern that. Imagine inheriting the throne of the Caesars and discovering that the throne is all you have. Imagine being crowned heir to the greatest title in the world and learning, within a week of the crown, that the treasury is empty, that the army is a few thousand men, that your empire is a city you could ride around in an afternoon, and that the only thing keeping it alive is a wall your ancestors built 1,000 years ago, and the slow indifference of the powers around you who have not yet decided to finish you off. The last emperors of the city spent their reigns doing something almost unbearably human. They went begging. They traveled, in person, the heirs of the Caesars, to the courts of the West, to kings and popes and princes, and they asked for help. They sat in foreign halls and made their case and offered what they had left, which was less and less, and they were received, often, with a kind of fascinated pity. The Roman emperor, the living relic, come to ask for soldiers and gold. Some courts gave a little, most gave promises, almost none gave enough, and the emperors went home, across a Europe that found them quaint and tragic, and not quite worth saving, to wait for the next year, and the year after that, watching the new power rise around them like a tide coming up a beach. Because while the city had been dying, something else had been being born. Out of the east, out of the steppes and the highlands, a young and ferociously vital people had come, and they did not have 1,000 years of glory weighing them down. They had hunger and discipline and faith, and the appetite of the genuinely new. They had been swallowing the lands of the old empire piece by piece for 100 years. They had crossed into Europe. They had taken the provinces, the cities, the trade routes. They had grown so large and so confident that by the time our story begins, the city of Constantine was no longer a rival to them. It was an island in their sea. A single Christian city, surrounded on every side by their territory, kept alive less by its own strength than by the fact that no one had yet bothered to swallow the last bite. And then a new ruler took their throne, a young man. And the young man looked at the city, that ancient, glittering thorn lodged in the very heart of his growing empire, and he decided that the time of waiting was over. But before we meet him, you have to understand the one thing that had kept the city alive through all of it. The thing the Romans of Constantinople trusted the way a child trusts its mother. The thing that, for 1,000 years, had never once failed. You have to understand the walls. If you had approached the city by land in the spring of 1453, the last thing you would see, the thing that would make you rein in your horse and simply stare, was not a church or a palace. It was the wall. It ran across the entire neck of the peninsula, sea to sea, a band of stone and brick and earth nearly 4 miles long, and it was, without exaggeration, the most successful piece of military engineering in the history of the world up to that moment. It had been built 1,000 years before our story, by an emperor whose name it still carried, and in all those centuries, through every war, every siege, every army that had ever come to break the city, it had been overcome from the outside exactly once, and that only by the treachery of fellow Christians in 1204, never by an enemy storming it in open battle. 1,000 years. Empires had risen and fallen, languages had been born and died. The whole of what we call the Middle Ages had played out from beginning to end, and across all of it, no foreign army had ever fought its way through these walls. So let me show you why. Because it was not one wall. It was a system, a machine for killing anyone foolish enough to attack it, built in depth, layer after murderous layer. Picture yourself as an attacker, on the plain before the city, looking at what you have to cross. First, a great ditch, a moat that could be flooded with water, wide and deep, an open killing ground you would have to descend into and climb out of, under a rain of arrows and stones and fire. Then, beyond it, a low outer wall, manned and bristling. And if by some miracle you took that, if you climbed it over the bodies of your friends, you would find yourself not inside the city, but trapped in a narrow space between walls, exposed, with nowhere to go, while above and behind you rose the thing itself, the inner wall. 40 feet of stone and brick, studded with towers nearly as tall again, each one a fortress in its own right, each one able to pour death down onto anyone caught in the trap below. To break into the city, you would have to take the ditch, and then the outer wall, and then survive the killing space, and then somehow scale or shatter a barrier as tall as a modern building, all while the defenders rained everything they had down upon you from a height you could not answer. It is no wonder the people of the city love those walls the way you love something that has saved your life so many times you've stopped imagining your life without it. The walls were not just defense, they were identity. They were the proof that God favored the city, that the prophecies were true, that no matter how small and poor and surrounded the empire became, the Second Rome was inviolable, untakeable, eternal. Generations of children grew up in the shadow of those towers believing, the way you believe the ground will hold you up, that the walls would always be there and would always hold. And here is the thing about a faith like that. It is a strength, right up until the moment it becomes a weakness. Because the people who trusted the walls so completely had stopped asking a dangerous question. They had stopped asking whether the world might produce something the walls had never been built to face. Those walls had been designed in an age of catapults and battering rams and ladders, an age in which the way you attacked stone was with muscle and torsion and patience. For 1,000 years, that was the only kind of war there was, and against that kind of war, the walls were simply perfect. But war does not stay still. And out beyond the walls, in the camp of the young Sultan, something was being built that would change what it meant to attack a wall forever. Something that could reach across the killing ground the engineers had never imagined an enemy crossing, and strike the stone itself, and shatter it. The walls had never failed. They were about to meet the thing that would make them fail. He was 21 years old. That is the first thing you should know about the man who set out to take the city, because almost everything that followed flowed from it. The Sultan Mehmed, the second of his name, had come to his throne young, and he had been, by the reckoning of the gray-bearded men who surrounded him, a disappointment. He had been placed on the throne once before, as a boy, when his father stepped aside, and the boy sultan's reign had gone badly enough that the father had to come back and take the power again. The old advisors, the powerful viziers who had served the father, looked at this intense, proud, untested young man, and they saw a problem to be managed. They did not see what was coming. They could not have. Almost no one ever does. Because behind the youth and the inexperience, Mehmed was something the world had not yet learned to recognize. He was brilliant, in a cold, total, frightening way. He spoke many languages. He read history, Greek history, the lives of the great conquerors of antiquity, and he did not read it the way a scholar reads, for pleasure. He read it the way a hunter studies the ground. He had grown up in the long shadow of the city, that ancient, unconquered prize that every ruler of his line had eyed and none had taken. And somewhere in his youth, it had stopped being a prize to him and become something closer to an obsession. He did not merely want the city. He had decided, with the absolute certainty of a young man who has never yet been broken, that he was the one who was meant to take it. That history had been holding it in reserve for him. We have to be careful here, because it is easy to flatten a man like this into a villain, a force of nature, a dark engine rolling toward an innocent city. He was none of those simple things. He was a human being, a young one, vain and curious and capable of cruelty and capable of grief, as we will see at the very end, when he stands inside the thing he has destroyed and weeps. He was driven by ambition, yes, but also by faith, by the conviction that taking the city was a sacred destiny, and by something more personal and more recognizable than either, the need to prove the men who had underestimated him catastrophically wrong. And in the winter before the siege, that young man did something that told everyone watching exactly how serious he was. He built a fortress, not at the city, but on the narrow strait of water just to the north of it, the channel through which all the grain, all the trade, all the lifeblood of the city had to flow from the sea beyond. He built it fast, in a single summer, working his men like demons, and when it was done, he had a stranglehold on the city's throat. From the new fortress, his guns could now sink any ship that tried to bring supplies down the strait. He had, in effect, closed the city's windpipe before he ever marched on its walls. When a ship tried to slip past without stopping to be inspected, his gunners sank it, and the survivors who made it to shore he had executed, and their captain he had impaled and left on the road as a message. The message was received. The city understood then that the young sultan everyone had dismissed was not playing the long game of his ancestors. He was coming, and he was coming now. But a fortress on a strait does not bring down the greatest walls in the world. For that, Mehmed needed something no one had ever had before. And here the story turns on one of those moments that seems, in hindsight, almost too perfect to be true. A moment that should make you ache, because it is the kind of small human decision that decides the fate of nations, and that no one recognizes as such while it is happening. There was a man, a gunmaker, a master of the new and terrifying art of casting cannon, an engineer of genius from the lands to the north. And before he ever went to the Sultan, this man came to the city. He offered his services to the emperor first. He stood before the heirs of Rome and told them what he could build. Guns greater than any the world had seen, guns that could break stone itself. And he asked to be paid what such a wonder was worth. And the emperor could not afford him. Let that settle. The empire was so poor, so hollowed out, so far past the days when it could buy whatever it wished, that when the very weapon that would one day shatter its walls walked through its gates and offered itself for sale, the city had to turn it away. They could not meet the price. They gave him a little, perhaps, a token, not nearly enough to keep a man of his talents. And so the gunmaker, like a craftsman anywhere who must eat, took his genius to the one buyer who could pay for it. He went to the Sultan, and the Sultan, who understood exactly what he was being offered, gave him everything he asked for and more. The empire that could not afford the gunmaker was destroyed by the gun he built for someone else. There is a whole philosophy of decline buried in that single fact. The way poverty is not just the absence of comfort, but the absence of choices. The way a power on the way down cannot even purchase its own survival when survival walks up and knocks on the door. The city did not lose the gunmaker because it didn't see his value. It lost him because it had already lost everything else. And what he built for the Sultan was a monster. It was a bombard, a single great gun, so vast that casting it was an undertaking on the scale of building a ship. Its barrel was longer than several men laid end to end, its mouth wide enough that a person could crawl into it, and it was made to hurl a stone ball weighing more than half a ton. They had to build a special road to move it, dragged by dozens of oxen and hundreds of men, creeping across the countryside toward the city at the pace of a slow walk. When they test-fired it, the report could be heard for miles, and the people in the villages around, it was said, were warned in advance so that the sound would not stop the hearts of pregnant women and frighten the wits out of children. The ball, when it landed, buried itself deep into the earth. This was the thing the walls had never been built to face. This was the new world, arriving in the form of a sound that had never existed before. A long, rolling, world-ending thunder that would soon be hammering, day after day, against the stones that 1,000 years of war had never broken. The young sultan had his weapon, he had his fortress, he had his army gathering, vast beyond counting. And inside the walls, the people of the city heard the rumors of what was coming, and they did the only thing they could do. They counted their defenders, and when they finished counting, the answer was so small that the emperor ordered the number kept secret. Because if the people of the city had known how few there truly were, he feared they would simply lose the will to fight at all. Here is the number the emperor hid. To defend 4 miles of wall against an army that may have numbered 80,000, perhaps more. A host so large that when it spread across the plain before the city it looked, the chroniclers said, like a field of grain stirring in the wind, like the sea itself come ashore. The city could field, in the end, somewhere around 7,000 men, and of those, fewer than 5,000 were its own. Sit with that ratio for a moment, because it is almost the entire story compressed into arithmetic. For every defender on the walls, there were perhaps 10, perhaps 15, perhaps 20 men in the camp below waiting to come for him. The wall had to be held along its whole length, every tower, every gate, every yard of it, because a single breach left unguarded was the death of everything. There were not enough men to do it. There were barely enough men to make a show of doing it. The emperor walked the circuit of his own defenses and counted the heads of the men who would die for him, and there were so few that he understood the truth at once. The city could not be saved by its own people. It could only be saved by a miracle, or by help from outside, or by the simple, stubborn refusal of 7,000 men to do the sensible thing and run. And yet, and this is the first of the things about the last days of the city that I find almost impossible to look at without my throat tightening, they did not run. They could have. Many in the city argued for surrender, or for terms, or for flight while the sea was still open. There were factions, bitter ones, who would almost rather have died than accept the help that was offered, for reasons we will come to that will seem insane to you until you understand them. The city was not a single brave heart. It was a frightened, divided, exhausted community of human beings staring at the end of their world and disagreeing, the way human beings always do, about what to do with it. But when the moment came, the overwhelming mass of them stayed. They stayed on the walls. They stayed in the city. They stayed beside an emperor who could promise them nothing but the chance to die where they were born. And to understand why, you have to understand him, the man at the center of it, the last of his line, the one who has no grave. His name was Constantine, the 11th emperor to bear it. And history has handed us a coincidence so heavy with meaning that it almost feels written. The city was founded by an emperor named Constantine, the son of a woman named Helena, and it would die under an emperor named Constantine, the son of a woman named Helena, the first Constantine and the last. The city's whole 1,000-year life folded neatly between two men of the same name, like a book closing on itself. He was not a young man. He was not a brilliant general or a great conqueror. He had no chance to be. He had spent his life in the impossible work of holding together something that was coming apart in his hands. He had ruled scraps of territory in the years before he took the throne, fighting small wars he could not win against odds he could not change. He had gone, as his predecessors went, to seek help in the West and found the same fascinated indifference they all found. He took the crown of the dying empire knowing exactly what it was, a chair in a burning house, and he sat in it anyway. And in the last weeks, the Sultan offered him a way out. This is the part that most cleanly reveals the kind of man he was. Mehmed sent word, by the customs of the age, that the emperor could leave. He could take his people, his treasure, what was left of his court, and go, to rule some other corner of the Greek lands as a lord under the Sultan's protection. He could live. His people could live. All he had to do was open the gates and walk away from the city, and the long horror could be avoided, and the blood that was coming need not be spilled. It was, by any rational measure, the right choice. The city could not be held. Everyone with eyes could see it. To refuse was to choose the deaths of thousands, including, almost certainly, his own. A wise man, a practical man, a man who loved his people more than his pride, might have taken the offer and saved what could be saved. Constantine refused, and the words attributed to him in that refusal have come down to us across the centuries. And whether he said them exactly or not, they are true to everything else we know of him. He said that to give up the city was not his to do, that the city did not belong to him. It belonged to all the people who had lived in it and died for it across 1,000 years, and to all who would come after, and to God. That as for leaving it to save his own life, he would rather die. That he would die with his people and his city. I want to be honest about how strange and even troubling a choice that is, because I don't think we serve these people by turning them into simple heroes. There is a reading of Constantine's refusal that calls it a magnificent act of loyalty, and there is a reading that calls it a catastrophe of pride. A man condemning thousands to death rather than bear the shame of being the emperor who let Rome end. Both readings have teeth. And I suspect the truth is that they are not really opposites at all. That the loyalty and the pride were the same thing, twisted together so tightly that not even the man himself could have pulled them apart. He had been raised from birth to be the link between heaven and earth, the living embodiment of an 1100-year sacred trust. To survive the death of that trust, to outlive his own role, to become a private man in a world without the city, perhaps that was a death he could not face, and the death by the sword was the easier one. But here is what I keep returning to. Whatever was in his heart, pride, faith, love, or all of them at once, he stayed. And by staying, he gave the 7,000 a thing that mattered more than numbers. He gave them an emperor who was not running, a man who, when the end came, would not be found in a ship slipping away in the dark, but on the walls, in the breach, with a sword in his hand. Men will die for that. It is one of the oldest and most dangerous facts about us. A frightened soldier, outnumbered 20 to 1, with every rational reason to flee, will sometimes hold his ground for no better reason than that the man beside him is holding his, and that the man at the top of the wall, the one who could have saved himself, chose not to. Courage, like fear, is contagious. Constantine could not give his people victory. He could not even give them a real chance. But he could give them the thing he had, which was the example of a man meeting his fate without flinching, and somehow, impossibly, it was enough to make 7,000 exhausted, terrified people stand on a doomed wall for 53 days. We will watch them do it. But first, I want to take you down off the wall and into the city itself in those last weeks, because the soldiers were not the only ones living through this. Behind every defender was a household, a street, a family waking each morning to the sound of the guns and wondering how many mornings were left. I want you to feel what it was to be an ordinary person in a city that knows it is going to die. It begins with the bells. For 1,000 years, the bells of the city had marked the hours, calling the faithful to prayer, ringing the great feasts, tolling the deaths of emperors. They were the heartbeat of the place, the sound that everyone had heard from birth, so constant that no one really heard it at all. And in the last weeks, the bells changed their meaning. Now, when they rang an alarm, all together, jangling and urgent, it meant the guns were firing, or the enemy was massing, or a section of wall had fallen and every hand was needed. The familiar sound became a sound of dread. The thing that had measured ordinary life now measured the approach of the end. Imagine the days inside the walls. The city had been under blockade for weeks, and food was running short. Not yet famine, but the constant gnawing anxiety of watching the stores dwindle with no way to refill them. The sea closed by the Sultan's ships, the land closed by his army. Prices climbed. People shared what they had and hoarded what they could, and the two impulses, generosity and fear, fought in every household the way they always do when the future closes in. Children, who do not understand sieges but understand hunger and the faces of frightened adults perfectly well, grew quiet and watchful. The old, who had lived through hard times before, told the young that the city had always survived, that the walls had never fallen, that God would not abandon the second Rome, and some of them believed it, and some of them said it precisely because they no longer did. And the work. This is the part we forget, the sheer physical labor of a city defending itself. The walls, hammered every day by the great guns, had to be repaired every night. And it could not be done by soldiers alone. There were not enough of them, and they were needed to fight. So the people did it. Men and women, old and young, by torchlight, in the dark, under the constant threat of attack, carried baskets of earth and rubble and stakes up onto the broken sections of wall and rebuilt them. They learned, the defenders did, a strange and important thing, that a wall of packed earth and timber and rubble, hastily thrown up, actually absorbed the cannon fire better than the ancient stone. The old wall shattered. The new earthworks swallowed the stone balls and held. And so every night, while the guns rested, the citizens of the city climbed up into the wounds in their own defenses and stuffed them with earth and their own labor and whatever they could carry. And every day the guns tore those repairs apart again, and every night the people went back up and did it again. Picture a woman doing that. A woman who has never held a weapon, who has spent her life inside the ordinary world of the household, carrying her child's whole future inside her like a held breath. Picture her at midnight, on a broken rampart, passing baskets of earth hand to hand with her neighbors, while the man she loves stands a few yards away with a spear, watching the dark for the next attack. She is not in any chronicle. No one wrote her name. But the wall held as long as it did partly because of her hands, and the hands of thousands like her. And when we talk about the 7,000 defenders, we should remember that behind them stood the whole population, doing the unglamorous, unnamed, exhausting work of trying to keep their world from ending, one basket of earth at a time. And over all of it, day and night, hung the question. The question that everyone carried and almost no one spoke aloud. How does it end? Because they were not fools. They could count, the same as the emperor could count. They could see the size of the army on the plain and feel the walls shaking under the guns and do the arithmetic of their own survival. And so the city, in its last weeks, did what frightened human beings have always done when the rational mind offers them nothing but despair. It turned to prophecy. The city had always been full of prophecies. Old sayings, half-remembered verses, predictions attributed to ancient saints and emperors, the kind of folk wisdom that accumulates around any very old place. And in the last days, the prophecies came alive in people's mouths because they were the only thing left that offered hope. There was a belief, deep and widespread, that the city could not finally fall, that at the last moment, when the enemy had broken in and reached the very heart of it, an angel would descend with a flaming sword and drive them back, and the empire would be saved and renewed. There was a belief about the great church that even if the enemy entered the city, they could never take that holiest of holy places, that a divine hand would protect it. There were darker prophecies too, ones that said the city would fall, that named the signs, that fixed the end, and people argued, in the streets and the markets and the churches, about which prophecies were true and which were false, the way drowning people argue about which piece of wreckage will float. We look at this from a great distance, and it is easy to feel a kind of pity, even a faint contempt. These poor people, clinging to angels and omens instead of facing facts. But I want to push against that, because I think it misunderstands something essential about us. When the facts offer you nothing but annihilation, hope is not stupidity. Hope is survival. The man who fights better because he believes an angel might save him is fighting better, and his belief, true or false, is doing real work in the world. The prophecies of the dying city were not a failure of reason. They were the human spirit doing what it has always done at the edge of the abyss, reaching for a story in which the abyss is not the end. We do the same. We have simply changed the names of the angels. And then, in those final weeks, the sky itself seemed to turn against them. And what happened next broke something in the city that the guns alone never could. But before the sky turned, I have to show you something about the men on the walls that I have been holding back, because it is one of the strangest and most quietly devastating facts of the whole siege, and it pays off a promise I made you at the very beginning, when I said the defenders were not who you would expect. Some of the men who died for the city were not from the city at all. This is the part the simple story leaves out. We imagine the defense of the Second Rome as the last Romans dying for their own home, and many of them were exactly that. But scattered along those walls, in the breaches, at the most dangerous points, were men who had no blood claim to the city whatsoever. Foreigners, outsiders, soldiers and sailors from the merchant cities of the West, the very West that had so often failed the city, the very West whose crusaders had once sacked it. Men of the rival trading republics who in ordinary times competed and even fought each other in the city's own harbor. Men from across the sea who happened to be there, or who came when the call went out, or who simply could have sailed away in the last open weeks and chose, instead, to stay and die in a doomed city that was not their own. Think about what that takes. You are a merchant captain, or a sailor, or a soldier of fortune, far from home, in a city you know is going to fall. You have a ship, or access to one. The sea is still open, for now. Every rational instinct, every sane calculation, every voice of self-preservation is screaming the same thing. Leave. Go home. This is not your fight, not your faith exactly, not your people, not your walls. No one would blame you. History would not even record that you had gone. And some of them stayed. The brilliant captain who held the most critical stretch of wall, the one whose wounding, at the very end, would help decide everything, he was one of these outsiders, a soldier from the West who had sailed to the city with his own band of fighting men, knowing what he was sailing into, and who had been given charge of the deadliest ground precisely because the emperor trusted these hard professional foreigners more than almost anyone. Whole crews stayed, whole companies. They manned sections of the wall, they fought in the harbor, they bled into the same stones as the Romans they had come to help, and a great many of them died there, far from whatever place had been their home, for a city that owed them nothing. Why? We can never fully know, and I suspect the answer was different inside every one of them. For some, it was faith, the sense that this was the wall between Christendom and what lay beyond it, and that to abandon it was to abandon something larger than any one city. For some, it was honor, the professional soldier's refusal to run from a post he had accepted. For some, it may simply have been the bond that forms between men who have stood in the dark together, waiting for an attack. The discovery that you cannot leave the people beside you, even when leaving is the only sensible thing left. And for some, perhaps, it was the oldest reason of all. The human need, when the end is coming anyway, to meet it as part of something, rather than alone on a ship slipping away in the dark, carrying the knowledge that you ran. I find these men almost unbearably moving, more in some ways than the Romans themselves, because the Romans were defending their home, and the foreigners were defending an idea. They had every excuse to leave, and they constructed, instead, every reason to stay. And it complicates the easy story we might want to tell, about the West abandoning the city, about Christendom failing its own. Because the West did fail the city, at the level of kings and popes and grand alliances. The great armies that might have saved it never came. But down on the actual walls, in the actual dark, individual human beings from that same West were dying, shoulder to shoulder, with the people they were supposed to have abandoned. History fails at the level of nations. Sometimes it is redeemed, a little, at the level of the single frightened man who decides not to get on the boat. Now hold those men in your mind, the foreign volunteers on the walls, because we are going to watch what their exhaustion costs, and we are going to watch one wound in one of them swing the fate of 1,000 years. But first you have to understand what the waiting did to all of them, Roman and foreigner alike, because the great guns did not only break stone. Picture the rhythm of it. The bombardment was not constant. The monstrous gun was so vast that it could be fired only a handful of times a day. It had to be cooled, cleaned, swabbed, reloaded with enormous labor between each shot. And there was always the danger, never far off, that the thing would crack and kill its own crew. So the defenders learned the terrible rhythm of the siege, the long, swelling silence, the distant, deep boom that you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. And then the wait, the endless, stretching second or two, while somewhere above, a stone ball heavier than a man came arcing down out of the sky toward the wall, and you did not know, you could never know, exactly where it would land. Imagine living inside that rhythm for 53 days. The mind cannot hold that kind of vigilance forever. It frays. Men stop sleeping properly. The constant expectation of the next shot, the next assault, the next alarm in the night, wore the defenders down in a way that had nothing to do with wounds. There is a particular exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from waiting too long for something terrible. The exhaustion of a body that has been braced for a blow for weeks and cannot unbrace, cannot rest, cannot ever quite believe it is safe. The guns were not only knocking down the walls, they were knocking down the men, hour by hour, shot by shot, grinding away not just the stone, but the human capacity to keep standing in front of it. And this is the thing that the simple arithmetic of the siege misses. We say the city fell because it was outnumbered, and that is true, but numbers alone do not capture it. The city fell, in the end, because 7,000 exhausted human beings could be ground down, in body and in nerve and in spirit, faster than 80,000 fresh ones, and because all the courage in the world cannot finally hold up a man who has not truly slept in 7 weeks, who has watched the walls he trusted shatter again and again, who has buried friends and rebuilt breaches in the dark, and stood every night braced for the attack that will end everything. They did not lose because they were cowards. They lost because they were human, and human beings have a limit, and the Sultan's whole strategy was simply to keep pressing until that limit was reached. It was reached on a single morning, but the sky cracked first. There came a night, near the end, when the moon should have been full. The city had pinned a strange and specific hope on that moon, because one of the old prophecies held that the second Rome could never fall while the moon was waxing, that only a waning moon could bring its end. So the people watched the sky and counted the nights and took comfort in the swelling silver disk above them, growing fuller each evening, a heavenly promise that the time of the city was not yet over. And then, on the night the moon reached its fullness, as the whole population watched, it went dark. We know now what it was: an eclipse. The Earth's own shadow sliding across the face of the moon, a thing of pure mechanics, predictable, meaningless. But the people on the walls did not know that. They saw the full moon, their promised sign of safety, blacked out and bloodied and devoured by the dark. And to them it could mean only one thing: the prophecy had turned. The protection was lifted. Heaven had withdrawn its hand from the city. You can almost feel the cold that must have moved through the streets that night. The thing they had clung to had been taken from them by the sky itself. And it did not stop there. In the days that followed, the omens seemed to multiply, each one landing on a population already cracking under the strain. There was a great procession, the most sacred icon of the city, an image of the Mother of God believed to have protected the place for centuries, carried through the streets in desperate prayer. And during the procession, the icon slipped from its bearers and fell into the mud, and when they tried to lift it, the chroniclers say, it seemed impossibly heavy, as though it did not want to rise. Then a storm broke over the city, sudden and violent, rain like nothing they had seen, the streets running like rivers, the procession scattered. And the next day, a strange, thick fog descended and lay over the city unnaturally, in a season when no fog should come. And that night, those keeping watch saw a strange light playing about the dome of the great church, a glow that flickered and rose and vanished, and the wisest and most frightened among them whispered that it was the light of God Himself, the divine presence, leaving the city at last. We can explain these things, or explain them away. The eclipse was an eclipse. The storm was a storm. The strange light may have been some trick of weather or fire reflected in the haze. But understanding the mechanism does not undo the human experience, and the human experience was devastating. A people already at the edge watched their God, as they understood it, gather up His protection sign by sign and withdraw. Whatever physical strength remained in the city, something in its spirit broke in those final nights. The prophecies that had promised salvation now seemed to promise doom, and there is no enemy more dangerous to a besieged people than the loss of the belief that they can be saved. And yet they stayed. That is the thing that keeps astonishing me the deeper we go. The signs turned against them. The moon went dark. The icon fell. The light left the dome. By every measure of their own faith, they had been abandoned. And still, the next morning, the soldiers were on the walls, and the citizens were carrying earth to fill the breaches. They had nothing left to believe in, and they held on anyway. There is a kind of courage that comes from hope. And there is a different, deeper, More terrible kind that begins exactly where hope ends. The courage of people who keep doing the work after they have stopped believing the work can possibly matter. The city was full of that second kind of courage in its final days. Maybe it is the only kind that was ever really worth the name. But the Sultan was not relying on omens. He was relying on engineering and patience, and an idea so audacious that when the people of the city woke one morning and saw what he had done, they could not at first believe their own eyes. To understand it, you have to understand the harbor and the chain. The city had one great vulnerability and one great protection, and they were the same thing: the water. Along one whole side of the city ran a deep, sheltered inlet of the sea, a long natural harbor, one of the finest in the world, the very thing that had made the city rich in the first place. The land walls, the great 1,000-year walls we have already stood beneath, faced the open country. But the walls along the harbor side were lower, weaker, less defended, because they had never needed to be strong. No enemy fleet could get into the harbor. And the reason no enemy fleet could get in was a single, ingenious, beautiful piece of engineering: a chain. Across the mouth of the harbor, from the city on one side to the fortified district on the other, the defenders had stretched an enormous iron chain. Its links, as thick as a man's arm, floated on great wooden barrels so that it lay across the water like a barrier laid by a giant. No ship could pass it. Any vessel that tried to force the harbor would foul itself on the chain and be left helpless under the fire of the walls. For centuries, this chain had sealed the harbor as completely as a locked door seals a room. The most dangerous side of the city was, because of it, the safest. The fleet of the defenders sat snug behind it, protected, and the Sultan's far larger fleet sat outside it, blocked, unable to bring its weight to bear on the weak harbor walls. The chain held. The Sultan's ships tried the open seaside and were beaten back. For a time, it seemed that the water, at least, was one front where the city was secure. And then the Sultan did the impossible. He decided that if his ships could not go through the chain, they would go around it, over land. I want you to understand the full madness and genius of what I am about to describe, because even now, knowing it happened, it strains belief. Behind the district across the harbor, there rose a steep ridge of hills. On the far side of those hills lay the open sea, where the Sultan's fleet rode at anchor, locked out. On the near side lay the protected water of the harbor itself, inside the chain. Between them stood the high ground, a barrier of earth and stone that any sane person would have called impassable to ships. The Sultan looked at that ridge and decided to carry his navy over it. In a single night, his engineers and laborers built a road across the hills, a track of greased wooden planks and runners, laid up one slope and down the other. And then, in the dark, they hauled their warships out of the water, set them on enormous wheeled cradles, and dragged them up and over the ridge, sails set, in some accounts, as if to mock the very idea of a ship moving on land, drums beating, men hauling on ropes by the hundred, oxen straining, entire ships lifted bodily out of one sea, pulled across a mountain of earth, and lowered into the protected harbor on the far side, behind the chain, where no enemy ship was ever supposed to be able to come. The people of the city woke to find dozens of the Sultan's warships floating in their own protected harbor, inside the chain, behind the door that could not be opened. In the one stretch of water that had been, for centuries, absolutely safe, the place where their own fleet sheltered, the place the weak harbor walls had trusted at their backs, there was suddenly an enemy navy that had no business existing there, that had crossed dry land to reach them, that had simply refused to accept the rules the city had relied upon for 1,000 years. Try to feel what that does to a defender's mind. The chain was not just a barrier, it was a certainty, one of the fixed facts of the world, like the walls. And in a single night, the Sultan had proven that the fixed facts were not fixed at all, that a man with enough will and enough men and enough ruthless imagination could simply rout around the things you thought could never be moved. It was not the ships themselves that did the deepest damage, though they did real damage. They forced the desperate, undermanned defenders to stretch their pitiful numbers even thinner, to pull men to guard the harbor walls that had never needed guarding. It was the message. The city had believed that some things were impossible. The Sultan had just demonstrated that he did not believe in impossible. And a man who does not believe in impossible, attacking people who have built their whole survival on the assumption that certain things cannot be done, that is a nightmare from which there is no waking. This is the thing I keep wanting you to see about the fall of the city. It was not, in the end, a story of brute strength against weakness, of a big army crushing a small one. That was always going to happen eventually, given the numbers. The deeper story is about the collision between a civilization that trusted in the permanence of its world, the eternal walls, the unbreakable chain, the protecting God, the thousand-year certainty, and a young man who simply did not accept that anything was permanent at all. The city's greatest strength, across its whole long life, had been its conviction that it was eternal. And in 1453, that conviction met the one kind of enemy it could not survive. One who had decided that nothing is eternal, and set out to prove it, stone by stone, and ship by ship, and certainty by certainty. And now the strength was almost spent. The walls were crumbling under the great guns. The harbor was breached. The food was running out. The omens had turned. The defenders were exhausted, past the point of exhaustion. Men who had not slept properly in weeks, holding broken walls with too few hands. The Sultan, out on the plain, gathered his vast army and made his final preparations. And word reached the city of what everyone already knew was coming: the great assault, the final throw, everything all at once. And on the last evening, before the night that would end the world they knew, the people of the city did something that I find almost unbearably beautiful. And I have to tell you about it slowly, because it is the emotional heart of everything we have been building toward. They put down their divisions, and they went, together, into the great church, to say goodbye. I have to step back, for a moment, and tell you about a wound the city carried into its final night, because without it, you cannot understand the miracle of what happened in the great church. The Christians of the city and the Christians of the West had been, for centuries, divided. They shared a Savior and a Scripture, but they had split over doctrine, over authority, over old grievances that had hardened into hatred, the sack of the city by the Crusaders chief among them. The two halves of Christendom regarded each other, by 1453, with a suspicion that ran bone deep. And in the city's final years, this division became a torment because it stood directly in the path of survival. Here was the agonizing arithmetic of it. The city could not save itself alone. Everyone knew that. Help could come only from the West, from the Pope, from the kingdoms of Europe. And the West had named its price: union. The Christians of the city would have to set aside their differences, accept the authority they had rejected for centuries, and reunite the faith on the West's terms. Do that, and perhaps the armies of Europe would come, refuse, and face the Sultan alone. You would think it an easy choice, survival against pride, but it was not easy at all. And the reason it was not is one of the most revealing things in this whole story, about what human beings will and will not surrender. To many in the city, union was not a compromise, it was a betrayal of the soul. They believed, sincerely, to the depths of their being, that their form of the faith was the true one, that the city was the last guardian of an unbroken, sacred tradition, and that to abandon it for Western help was to save the body of the city by killing the very thing that made it worth saving. There is a phrase that has come down to us from those bitter arguments, attributed to one of the leading men of the city, and it captures the whole tragic absolutism of it. He is said to have declared that he would rather see the Sultan's turban ruling in the city than the hat of a Western cardinal. Read that again. He would rather be conquered by the enemy of his faith than saved by a fellow Christian on terms he found false. We hear that and recoil. It sounds like madness, like a man choosing death over a haircut. But it is not madness. It is the most human thing imaginable, raised to a terrible pitch. It is a person saying, "There are things more important to me than survival." There is a version of being saved that is worse than dying. I would rather lose everything as myself than keep everything as something I have agreed to become. We may think him a fool, but notice that we honor exactly that logic when we praise a martyr or a patriot who will not betray a cause to save his skin. The city's refusal to buy survival at the price of its soul is either the noblest or the most self-destructive thing in this story. And once again, I have come to believe it is both, and that the two cannot be separated, because they never can in us. So the city entered its final siege divided against itself, some accepting union and the slim hope of Western help, others rejecting it and the priests who preached it, ordinary people refusing even to enter churches where the union had been proclaimed. The population split down the middle on the eve of its annihilation. It is one of the saddest things in the whole account, a doomed people with days to live, unable to stand together even at the end, the old hatred outlasting even the will to survive. And then came the last night, and on the last night, the division ended. As the sun went down on the evening before the final assault, with everyone in the city now certain of what the dawn would bring, the people did something that no decree could have commanded and no argument could have produced. They stopped fighting each other. The ones who had accepted union and the ones who had rejected it, the Western soldiers who had come to help and the citizens who had distrusted them, the priests of one persuasion and the priests of the other, all of them, by the thousand, made their way through the streets of the dying city and up to the great church, the holiest building in their world, the one place that meant everything to all of them, no matter how they had quarreled. And they held one last service together. Try to see it. The great church, the most magnificent interior the medieval world ever raised, vast beyond the scale of anything in the West, its enormous dome floating above the worshippers as though held up by light itself, filled, that final night, with thousands upon thousands of people who knew they were almost certainly going to die in the morning. The lamps burning, the old chants rising up into that impossible dome, the same chants that had risen there for 900 years. Soldiers came down from the walls in their armor to take the sacrament, and then climbed back up to die at their posts. Families came together. Enemies of doctrine knelt side by side and forgave one another, because in the face of the end, the things that had divided them had simply ceased to matter. The emperor himself came, the last Constantine, and he is said to have asked forgiveness of everyone present for any wrong he had done them, and to have taken the sacrament like a man preparing not for battle but for death, and then to have gone out to the walls to take his place among his soldiers. I think about that night more than almost anything else in this whole story, because the city, which had been unable to unite to save its life, united perfectly to face its death. The thing that argument and necessity and the threat of annihilation could not accomplish, the simple shared knowledge of the end accomplished completely. When there was a future to fight over, they fought. When the future was gone, they were one people again. There is something almost too sad and too true in that, the way human beings so often only manage to set aside what divides them when it is finally too late for the reconciliation to do anything but break your heart. And there is a question buried in it that I cannot stop turning over, and I want to hand it to you to carry, because I do not have an answer. Was that final unity a defeat or a victory? They lost the city. The Union came too late to save a single stone of it. And yet, on the last night, they became what they had failed to be for centuries. One community, forgiven and forgiving, gathered in the light of the Great Dome. Nothing was saved, and something was, perhaps, redeemed. I genuinely do not know which of those weighs more. I am not sure the question even has a bottom. But I know that thousands of people who were about to lose everything chose, in their last free hours, to spend those hours making peace with each other. And whatever else the fall of the city was, it was also that. When the service ended, they went out into the dark. The soldiers to the walls, the families to their homes, to wait. The emperor rode the circuit of the defenses one last time in the night, checking the broken walls, the exhausted men, the points where the morning would come. And then everyone took their place, and the city fell silent, and waited. And across the plain, the vast army of the Sultan lit its fires and waited too, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath in the few remaining hours before the end of 1,000 years. The assault came in the deep dark before dawn. It began with noise. The Sultan had planned it to overwhelm not just the walls, but the mind. And so the attack opened in the blackness before dawn with a wall of sound. Every drum, every trumpet, every clashing cymbal in that enormous army let loose at once, a roar designed to terrify, rolling across the plain and breaking against the city like a physical thing. And then, behind the noise, the assault came. Understand how Mehmed intended to win, because it is brutally simple, and it is the logic of every overwhelming force in history. He had men almost without number, and the defenders had almost none. So he would attack in waves, and he would never stop. The first wave would hit the walls, and fight, and die, and exhaust the defenders. And before the defenders could rest, before they could even catch their breath or bind their wounds or replace the men they had lost, the second wave would come, fresh, over the bodies of the first, and then a third. The defenders could not be replaced. Every man who fell on the walls was simply gone, a permanent subtraction from a number that was already impossibly small. The attackers could be replaced endlessly. It was not a battle. It was a machine for grinding down a finite thing with an infinite thing, and given enough hours, the outcome was arithmetic. The first wave was made of the least valued troops, the irregulars, the adventurers, the men driven forward as much by the lash and the hope of plunder as by anything else. They flung themselves at the walls and the defenders cut them down, and the attack failed, and it was meant to fail. It was meant to do nothing but tire the defenders and use up their strength and their arrows and their will. It worked. By the time the second wave came, better troops, disciplined, pressing the attack with real skill, the men on the walls had already been fighting for hours in the dark, and they were fewer, and they were spent, and still they held. They held through the second wave too. The chronicles speak of the defenders fighting with a desperate brilliance, the emperor among them in the thick of it, the Western soldiers and the Greeks side by side in the breaches where the great guns had broken the walls, throwing back assault after assault in the narrow, body-choked space, holding a line that should not have been holdable by so few against so many. For a few hours, in the dark before the dawn, it almost seemed they might do the impossible. And then, as it so often does, everything turned on small things. Two small things, in the space of a few terrible minutes. The first was a wound. There was a commander, a soldier from the West, a brilliant and experienced captain who had come to the city with a band of fighting men and had been given charge of the most critical, most threatened stretch of the walls, the place where the great guns had done their worst and the fighting was fiercest. He had been, by every account, magnificent, the heart of the defense at the very point where the city would live or die, holding the breach hour after hour, his presence worth 1,000 men, because the defenders trusted him and fought harder for him. And in the worst of the fighting, he was struck. Badly, gravely wounded in the chest or the arm, accounts differ, but the wound was severe, and he was in agony, and he believed he was dying. And he asked to be carried from the wall. I want to be careful and human about this because it is one of the most consequential and most painful moments in the whole story, and it would be easy and cheap to call it cowardice. It was not. He was a brave man who had fought beyond what anyone could ask, and he was grievously wounded, and a man in that condition is not making calm decisions about the fate of empires. The emperor himself, the chronicles say, begged him to stay, pleaded with him to remain at his post, even wounded, even just visible, because the captain understood, as the emperor understood, that it was not only his sword that mattered, but the fact of his presence, the steadiness it gave to the exhausted men around him. But the captain was in too much pain, or too much fear, or simply past the point where the will can override the body, and he insisted on being taken down. A gate in the inner wall was opened to carry him through to safety, and the defenders saw him go. That is the thing. In the chaos and the dark and the exhaustion, the men holding the breach saw their commander being carried away from the wall, and they did not know it was a wound. They thought it was a retreat. They thought the line was breaking, and the defense held together by nothing but will and the example of the men beside them began, at that one critical point, to come apart. Not all at once, but a wavering, a loss of the thread, a few men pulling back, which made the men beside them pull back, the contagion of courage suddenly running in reverse and becoming the contagion of fear. The single most important section of the wall, at the single most important moment, began to lose its grip. And in that exact moment, the second small thing happened, and it is the kind of detail that should make you want to reach back through 6 centuries and stop it with your hands. Somewhere along the great walls there was a small gate, a sally port, a little postern used for sorties, one of many in that vast circuit of defenses. And someone, in the confusion, had left it unlocked, or unbarred, or it had been used and not properly secured in the chaos of the fighting. The accounts are uncertain, as such things always are, lost in the smoke. But a handful of the Sultan's soldiers found it. They got through it, into the space between the walls, and they climbed up onto a tower. And they did the one thing that, more than any cannon, ends a siege. They raised their banner over the wall. That was all it took. A flag where a flag should not have been. Because the defenders, already wavering from the loss of their commander, looked up and saw the enemy's colors flying from their own tower. And the meaning was instant and total and required no words. The wall was breached. The enemy was inside. It was over. And the thought that the wall had been taken did far more damage than the small band of men who had actually taken that one piece of it, because the cry went up, the wall is breached, the enemy is in the city, and a defense that had held against 80,000 men for 53 days dissolved, in the space of a few minutes, into the oldest and most human of all responses to terror. They broke. They ran. The line that could not be beaten was not, in the end, beaten. It simply lost its nerve, all at once, the way a rope that has held a great weight for a long time does not fray slowly, but snaps. And once a wall is lost, it is lost everywhere. The attackers poured through the breach and over the wall and through the gates in a flood. The waves that had been breaking against the city for 53 days, suddenly finding the barrier gone, rushing in, and the defenders who had held so long were swept away or cut down or scattered into the streets behind them. And the great army of the Sultan was inside the city of Constantine for the first time in 1,000 years. It was just after dawn. And the last emperor, the last Roman emperor, the 11th Constantine, heir to an unbroken line 1,100 years deep, was somewhere in that chaos, at the wall, in the breach, where he had taken his place. We do not know exactly what happened to him. That is the haunting, fitting, unbearable truth of it. The accounts disagree and trail off into legend. What most of them say, what the tradition has held for 6 centuries, is this, that when he saw the wall was lost, and the city was falling, and there was nothing left to defend, he did not run. He did not look for a ship. He did not try to bargain or flee or save himself. He is said to have torn off the imperial regalia, the marks of his rank, the purple, the symbols that would have made him a priceless prisoner, so that no one would know him, so that he would die not as the emperor to be captured and paraded, but as one more soldier among the soldiers. And then he is said to have drawn his sword, and turned and charged back into the oncoming enemy, into the place where the fighting was thickest, and vanished into it. And that is the last anyone ever saw of him. He was never found. In all the searching afterward, and the Sultan, who wanted proof of his great enemy's death, searched hard, no one could ever identify his body among the dead. The last Roman emperor disappeared into the fall of his own city, and was never seen again, leaving no corpse, no grave, no certainty. Only the image of a man throwing away his crown, so that he could die anonymous in the breach of the wall his ancestors had built. the longest political story in the history of the Western world, the line that ran from Augustus through the Caesars, through 1,000 years of emperors in the city, does not end with a death we can point to. It ends with a disappearance, with a man who chose to become no one in the last moments, so that the empire would not end with a captured emperor on his knees. It is the strangest and somehow the most perfect ending a 1,000-year empire could have. The story does not conclude. It simply walks into the smoke and is gone. But the emperor's death, however much it has captured the imagination of the centuries, was the smallest part of what happened that morning. Because while the last Constantine vanished into legend, the city, the real city, the tens of thousands of ordinary people who had carried baskets of earth to the walls and prayed in the great church and waited in their homes through the long siege, the city was now wide open to an army that had been promised, by the customs of the age, 3 days to take whatever they wished. I have to tell you what happened next, and I have to tell you carefully, because it is the part the romantic accounts hurry past, and the people it happened to deserve better than to be hurried past. When a city was taken by storm in that age, when it refused to surrender and had to be broken by force, the law of war that everyone understood gave the victorious soldiers the right to sack it. 3 days of plunder. 3 days in which the discipline that held an army together was deliberately released, and the men who had fought and bled and watched their friends die at the walls were turned loose on the people inside to take their reward in goods and bodies and lives. It was understood. It was expected. It was the dark engine that drove men to climb walls in the first place, the promise that if you survived, the city would be yours to ravage. And so the city of Constantine, the second Rome, the holiest city in Eastern Christendom, endured 3 days of horror. I am not going to dwell on the worst of it in detail, because there is a kind of telling that becomes its own cruelty, that turns suffering into spectacle, and I will not do that to them. But you have to understand what it was, in human terms, or you have not understood the fall of the city at all. The soldiers poured through the streets, they broke into the houses, they took everything of value, and then took the people themselves, to be enslaved, sold, scattered across the world, families torn apart in a single morning, children separated from parents who would never learn what became of them. The entire intimate web of a 1,000-year-old community ripped open in a few hours. The people who had survived the siege now faced something worse than the siege. The ones who had carried earth to the walls, the women I asked you to picture passing baskets in the dark, the old who had said the city would never fall, the children who had grown quiet and watchful, all of them, now, at the mercy of men who had been given license to show none. And here is where the prophecy comes back. Do you remember? The belief, held so fiercely, that even if the enemy entered the city, the great church could never be taken, that it was the one inviolable place, that a divine hand would protect it. As the city fell, the people remembered that prophecy, and they ran for the great church. They poured into it by the thousand, the desperate, the terrified, families and priests and soldiers, and the old and the young, crowding into that vast space beneath the great dome, barring the enormous doors, and waiting. Waiting for the miracle. Waiting for the angel with the flaming sword. Waiting for God to do, at the last possible instant, the thing the prophecy had promised, to descend and drive the enemy out, and save the city and the faithful gathered in the holiest place on earth. The chants rose up into the dome one final time. The lamps burned. The people pressed together in the half-dark, and prayed, and watched the great doors, and waited for heaven to keep its promise. The doors were broken down, the soldiers came in, and there was no angel. I find this almost the hardest moment in the whole story to sit with, harder, in a way, than the death of the emperor, because the emperor at least chose his end, and these people were simply waiting, in the holiest place they knew, for a salvation that every fiber of their faith had promised them was coming. The miracle did not come. The prophecy was not kept. Heaven, as far as anyone in that church could tell, was silent. And the people gathered there were taken, in the place they had believed could never be taken, beneath the dome that had been built to be the very threshold of heaven on earth. We can stand at our distance and say that, of course, there was no angel, that prophecies are not promises, that hope of that kind was always going to end in heartbreak. But I want you to resist just for a moment the comfort of that distance. Because the question those people were really asking, beneath the specific prophecy, beneath the specific faith, is the question every human being asks when the worst comes. Is anyone going to save us? Is there a hand that reaches in at the end when we have done everything we can and it is not enough? They asked it in the most concentrated possible form, thousands of them, in a single room, in the last hour of their world. And the answer they received is the answer that has so often come back across all of history. And it is the hardest answer there is. Sometimes no one comes. Sometimes you do everything right and hold on past the point of hope and gather in the holiest place you know and pray with your whole heart, and the doors break down anyway, and there is no angel, and the only thing left is what you brought into the room with you, each other, and the way you choose to meet the end. That is the part I think they did not fail. The angel did not come. But they came, for each other, to that church, on the last night to make peace, in the last hour to face it together. The salvation they prayed for did not arrive. The salvation they could give one another, the only kind that was ever actually in their power, they gave to the full. And maybe that is the only kind there ever is. Maybe the angel was always going to be the person kneeling beside you, and the grace was always going to be the choice to face the dark together rather than alone. I don't know, but I know which of those two kinds of salvation was real. In the great church, on the morning the city fell. And it was not the one with the flaming sword. And then, on the third day, the man who had caused all of it rode into the city he had spent his whole young life dreaming of taking. The Sultan Mehmed, now and forever after to be called the Conqueror, the title fused to his name for all of history, entered the fallen city in triumph. He had done what no ruler of his line had managed, what besiegers had failed to do for 1,000 years. He was 21 years old, and he had taken the second Rome, and he had become, in a single morning, one of the immortal names of history. By every measure that an ambitious young man could imagine, it was the supreme moment of his life, the absolute summit of triumph. And the accounts tell us that when he reached the great church, when he dismounted and walked into that vast and luminous space, the holiest building of the empire he had just destroyed, the most magnificent interior the medieval world had ever raised, the conqueror did not exult. He wept. There is a tradition, told and retold, that as Mehmed stood beneath the great dome of the captured church, looking at the ruin of the most beautiful thing the old world had made, he murmured a line of poetry, old verses, in the manner of the melancholy poets, about the passing of empires, about how the spider weaves its web in the palace of the Caesars, and the owl calls the watch in the towers of the great kings. A meditation, in the very hour of his victory, on the impermanence of all glory, including, the lines quietly imply, his own. I want to be honest that we cannot fully trust these stories. They reach us across centuries and through many hands, and the conqueror weeping is exactly the kind of detail that later tellers love to add. But I think it points at something true, even if it is not literally accurate. And the something it points at is this. Mehmed was not a simple monster who wanted only to destroy. He was, in his way, an admirer of the very thing he was destroying. He had read the old histories. He saw himself as the heir of the conquerors of antiquity. He did not want to erase the city. He wanted to possess it, to make it his own great capital, to inherit its glory rather than simply end it. And so, it is entirely possible that the young man standing in the conquered church, at the absolute peak of his triumph, felt the thing that all conquerors at some level must feel, and few admit, that the prize, once taken, is never quite what it was when it stood beyond reach. That to possess a thing, you must first kill the version of it that you wanted. That he had reached for the eternal city and found, in his hands, a broken and bleeding place, its people enslaved, its glory ash, and the eternal thing he had hungered for already gone, destroyed, in the very act of taking it. And here is the turn that makes the whole thing land, the recontextualization I have been holding back. Because the lines Mehmed is said to have murmured about the spider in the palace, the owl in the tower, the passing of all earthly power, were not really about the city, or not only. A man clever enough to read the old histories and quote the old poems in the hour of his triumph was clever enough to know that the lesson cut both ways. The city had believed itself eternal, and it had fallen. His own empire, however mighty, however young, however certain of itself, would one day, by the same law that governed all things, fall too. The spider would one day weave in his palaces. The owl would one day call in his towers. He was not standing over the corpse of a uniquely doomed civilization. He was standing over a preview of his own. That, I think, is why the image of the weeping conqueror has survived for 600 years, even though we cannot prove it. Because it contains the deepest truth of the whole story, the one the city had built its entire soul around, without being able to save itself with it. Everything ends. The greatest, the most beautiful, the most eternal seeming, all of it ends. The city had known this. Its faith was steeped in it. And in the end, the knowledge did not save the city, and it would not save the conqueror either, and it will not save us. The only question the fall of the city leaves open is not whether everything we build will fall. That question is closed. It always was. The only question is what we do with the time before it does. The city fell on a single morning, but the fall did not end on that morning. And this is the part that almost no one feels properly. Because we treat the date as a full stop, when it was really the splash of a stone into a pool. And the ripples went out across the whole world, and some of them are still moving. Think first of what physically scattered. The city had been, for centuries, the great storehouse of the ancient world's mind. While Europe had forgotten how to read the old texts, the scholars of the city had kept them, copied them, studied them, preserved the philosophy and the mathematics and the literature of Greece and Rome in libraries that survived nowhere else. And in the decades before the fall, as the end grew obviously near, those scholars had begun to leave. They saw what was coming and they carried what they could: the manuscripts, the knowledge, the living memory of the ancient world, out of the dying city and into the West. And they arrived in a Europe that was, at that very moment, beginning to wake up. They walked into the Italian cities at the dawn of the great rebirth of learning, carrying with them the very texts and the very expertise that the rebirth was hungry for, and they poured fuel onto a fire that was just catching. The Renaissance of the West, the rediscovery of the ancient world that would reshape European civilization and, through it, the whole modern world, was fed, in part, by refugees from the fall of the city, scholars fleeing the death of the old empire with the wisdom of antiquity in their baggage. There is a strange and beautiful symmetry in that, almost too neat to be born, that the death of the last living piece of the ancient world helped to spark the West's rediscovery of the ancient world. The city, in dying, scattered its mind across Europe like seeds, and some of the deepest roots of the world you and I live in grew from exactly that scattering. So the fall of the city was not only an ending, it was, in the cruel and indirect way that history actually works, also a beginning. The same event that meant unbearable horror for the people inside the walls meant, for the wider world, a transmission, a passing on, a seed carried out of the fire. I find that almost impossible to hold in a single thought, that the worst day in the life of those tens of thousands of people was also, in the long accounting, one of the days that helped make the modern mind. History does not care about our sense of justice. It takes the agony of the few and converts it indifferently into the inheritance of the many. and it never asks the few whether the trade was fair. And think of what else changed. The fall of the city severed something the West had relied upon without quite noticing. The old land routes of trade to the east, the spices and silks and treasures that had flowed through the city for 1,000 years, now controlled by a power the Western kingdoms feared. And so the merchants and the kings of Europe began to look for another way to reach the riches of the East, a way that did not pass through the city, a way around, by sea, westward, into the unknown ocean, and southward around the bottom of the unmapped world. You see where this is going. Within a few decades of the fall of the city, ships were pushing out into the Atlantic in search of a new route to the east, and one of them, sailing west, would blunder into two entire continents that the old world did not know existed. The Great Age of Exploration, the European reach across the planet that would remake the entire globe, for better and for terrible worse. Its causes are many and tangled, but woven through them is this. The door to the east had slammed shut at the city, and Europe went looking for another door, and found, instead, a new world. The fall of one ancient city helped, in its ripples, to set in motion the encounter that would reshape every continent on Earth. This is the thing I keep wanting you to feel about that single morning in the spring of 1453. It was not a small, sad, faraway event. The death of a fated empire that had outlived its time, a footnote at the end of the medieval age. It was a hinge. The world before it and the world after it were different worlds, and we are standing, all of us, on the far side of that hinge. The Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, the modern map of faith and power across two continents, even the long argument about where the West ends and the East begins, all of it bears the fingerprints of the day the city fell. We are downstream of it. We have always been downstream of it. Most of us simply never knew the name of the river. Before we close this, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually sit with it, because I think it is the real reason any of us are still here, 6 centuries after these people turned to dust. Why does it matter? Why should you care about a city that fell before your country existed, full of people who spoke a language most of us cannot read, praying to a version of a faith most of us do not share, defending walls that are, today, just a long line of broken stone with grass growing through it? Why does the image of an old emperor throwing off his crown to die anonymous still reach somewhere into your chest? Why does the woman carrying earth to the wall in the dark, the one no one wrote down, feel, when you imagine her, almost like someone you are responsible for remembering? I think it is because, underneath the strangeness of their world, they were facing the thing that you and I spend most of our lives arranging not to look at. They knew their world was ending. Not as a vague someday, the way we all distantly know we will die. They knew it specifically, with dates, with a countdown they could hear in the firing of the guns. They got to do the thing almost none of us ever have to do, to stand at the actual, visible end of everything they loved and decide in full knowledge how to spend the last of it. And look at what they chose. They could have run. Many could have, especially early, while the sea was open. They could have surrendered and saved their lives, as the Sultan offered. They could have spent the last days in despair, or in looting, or in turning on each other, and they had every reason to, divided as they were. But the overwhelming mass of them chose, instead, to stand on the walls and to repair the breaches in the dark, and to come together on the last night in the great church, and forgive each other and face the end as one people, knowing it would not save them, knowing the angel might not come. They chose to meet the death of their world with dignity, with each other, and with their hands still doing the work, right up until the work was swept away. We hide from the end. That is the great project of our comfortable age, to push death so far out of sight that we can live as though it were optional, as though we had infinite time, as though the people and the places and the world we love were permanent fixtures that will always be there. The people of the city could not afford that illusion. The end was too close, too loud, too undeniable. And so they did the thing we are too comfortable to do. They looked at it. They stood in front of the actual end of everything and they did not look away, and they decided who they were going to be in the face of it. And here is the thing I find almost unbearably moving about them. The thing that turns this from a tragedy into something stranger and finer. They lost. Let us be completely clear about that. The city fell. The empire ended. The angel did not come, and the walls did not hold, and the prophecy was not kept, and the people in the great church were taken in the place they swore could never be taken. By every measure that the world counts as winning, they lost everything. And yet, 600 years later, here we are, in a world they could not have imagined, in lives they could not have dreamed, and we are speaking their names, or trying to, because they had so few. We are standing on their walls in our minds. We are carrying earth with the woman in the dark, and refusing the Sultan's offer with the emperor, and weeping in the great church with the ones who waited for the angel. They lost the city, but the city is not entirely gone. Not while we still wonder about them. Not while a stranger, 6 centuries downstream, can sit in the dark and feel the weight of their last morning press against his own. That is the only afterlife that history can actually grant. Not the angel, not the miracle. Memory. The stubborn refusal of the living to let the dead fall completely out of the world. And by remembering them, even like this, even imperfectly, even as half-imagined figures on a broken wall, we give them something the conquerors could not take, and the chroniclers did not bother to record. We say, "You were here. You stood. It mattered that you stood." The people of the city built their whole soul around a single piece of knowledge, that nothing lasts, that everything they loved was already passing, that to be alive is to stand in a river carrying everything downstream and away. It did not save them. It was never going to save them. Nothing was. But it taught them how to live, and more than that, it taught them how to end, with their eyes open, with their hands working, with each other, in the light of the great dome, on the last night of the world. And the most beautiful thing they left us is not the walls or the church or the scattered manuscripts that lit the Renaissance. It is the lesson underneath all of it, that a thing does not have to last to have mattered, that the city was not made meaningless by ending. The morning is not made less beautiful by the fact that it ends. That a life lived and lost, even a life with no name, even a life on the losing side of history, even a life that ended in a sacked city under an indifferent sky, was still a life, still a whole universe, still worthy of being seen. So the next time you feel, as that emperor felt, the walls of something you love beginning to fail, some part of your life, some certainty you trusted, some world you assumed would always be there, remember the city. Remember that everything ends, that it always has, that the most eternal seeming things in the world are only ever a waning moon away from the dark. And remember what they did with that knowledge. Not despair, not denial, but attention, dignity, each other, the choice to stand and to repair the breach one more time in the dark, and to face the end as themselves. The walls of the cities still stand, in part, even now. Long stretches of broken stone running across the neck of the land, grass and wildflowers growing in the cracks where the great guns struck, children playing in the shadow of towers that held the oldest empire in the world together for 1,000 years and then, on a single morning, did not. People walk past them every day without knowing what they are, and somewhere along that line of stone is the place where an emperor threw off his crown and disappeared into the smoke. And there is no marker there, because no one ever knew exactly where it was. He has no grave. But he has this. He has the fact that 600 years downstream, in a world he could not have imagined, a stranger paused in the dark to remember a man who chose to die without a name so that an empire would not end on its knees. That is not nothing. In a world built on impermanence, where everything is carried downstream and away, The act of remembering is a small, stubborn refusal. It is one more flower placed in the alcove of a passing moment. It is the living reaching back across the centuries to touch the hand of the dead and say, "I know you were here." The mist is on the water of the harbor now, the way it was 1,000 mornings before the end and 10,000 mornings since. The walls are quiet. The great dome still stands, holding up its impossible weight of light over a city that has been 100 different things since it stopped being the second Rome. And the people who lived and fought and prayed and were forgotten there, the woman with the basket of earth, the boy at the breach, the priest in the great church, the emperor with no grave, they are gone, all of them, gone down the river with everything else, exactly as they always knew they would be. Almost everything, because some things echo. A way of standing in front of the end. A people gathered in the light to forgive each other on the last night of their world. The stubborn human refusal to run, even when running is the only sane thing left to do. These crossed the centuries and found their way to you, and now they live, for a moment, in you too. And one day, someone will be downstream of you and of everything you are trying so hard to hold on to. And maybe, if you are lucky, they will pause for a breath in the dark and remember and understand. We close the page on them gently now. We let them rest. We carry what they gave us, and we walk on. And this, the silence of a vanished empire, the broken walls above the water, the last morning of a world that believed it would last forever. This was one of history's last chapters.